Okay, so we're going to start today with the new Perek Shvi'i. The daf is Masekhet, but we are going to start at the bottom of Samach Zayin Amud Bet, and this Perek is a very fundamental Perek for understanding Hilchot Shabbat on two levels. Number one, because it discusses how we deal with issues of liability for the violation of Shabbat conceptually, and then it's going to get into, in the second Mishnah of the Perek, it's going to get into the 39 melachot of Shabbat. So it has a lot of fundamental principles of Shabbat, and in fact the name of it is fundamental principle. Kelal gadol amru b'Shabbat. They said a great principle regarding Shabbat. Kol hashocheach ikar Shabbat va'asa melachot harbe b'Shabbatot harbe. So the principle that we need to understand in order to fathom the entire Mishnah and what's going to be the ensuing discussion is that we generally think of liability, let's say for the violation of Shabbat, you have to bring a korban chatat. If a person violates Shabbat, they bring a korban chatat. So we generally think of the korban is brought for the violation. So you would think if you did 10 violations, you bring 10 korbanot. You did one violation, one korban, and 1,000 violations, 1,000 korbanot. But it doesn't actually work in terms of violations. It works in terms of shegagot, which means it goes by the number of mistakes that the person made. You could do 100 actions, all based on the same mistake. Really, you've made one mistake. It just manifested itself 100 times. So what the korban is brought for, the principle here that it has to be sort of derived from what we're about to read, and the principle that will help us understand what we're about to read, is that korbanot are brought not for the number of violations, but for the number of mistakes that led to the violation. So keep that in mind. So now he says, Kol hashochech ikar Shabbat. If a person forgot the entire concept of Shabbat, ve'asa melachot harbe b'Shabbatot harbe, and he did many melachot on many Shabbatot, so eno chayav ela chatat achat. He's only liable for one korban chatat, one sacrifice. Why? Because let's say this person violated 100 Shabbatot. He went to work, he cooked, he harvested, he sowed, he did everything. But what was his one mistake? He simply didn't know the concept of Shabbat. It wasn't that he didn't know a specific halakha of Shabbat. It wasn't that he didn't know that today is Shabbat. He didn't know the concept of Shabbat altogether. So everything really derives from one concept, one mistake. That's why it's only one korban. Even if there were hundreds and hundreds of violations. Take a guy off the street. Maybe he was raised with something, but by the time he reaches adulthood, he left Judaism behind, and he doesn't even think it's Saturday, Sunday, Monday. It's not on his radar. So there's no concept of Shabbat for that person in his mind. He just lives every day like it's an ordinary day, and therefore it's all one violation.
So
all one mistake, I should say.
When they say shocheya, it doesn't matter whether it's bishul.
We're going to get to that. That's why I didn't want to say. That's why I'm being non-committal on that. Okay. So Gemara is going to discuss that. Hayodea ikar Shabbat. Say you have a person who knows the concept of Shabbat, but the problem is v'asa melachot harbe b'Shabbatot harbe. Why did he do a lot of melachot on a lot of Shabbatot? Because he keeps forgetting that it is Shabbat. His calendar is one day behind. He thinks that today is actually Sunday. Okay, so what happens? When everyone else is doing Shabbat, he thinks it's Friday. When everyone else is doing Sunday, he's doing Shabbat. Let's say, for instance, all right, whatever it is. So he's off. Right, that's even more complicated.
What about going across the date line?
That issue of not knowing that they're traveling the midbar, that comes later as an actual case where the person completely loses what the calendar is. So let's say here, even if the person for just a couple of weeks he's disoriented for whatever reason, and he doesn't realize that it's Shabbat. The simple case is you don't realize it's Shabbat. You wake up in the morning for whatever reason. No fun. It's not that you had the wrong calendar. You just wake up in the morning and you completely forgot it was Shabbat. You thought it was Sunday. One time somebody came here. They came here and they thought. Well, I don't want to say what it was, but one time somebody came here on Friday. It was Thursday or Friday. He came in. He said, "Andrea, why are you working in the office?" He came in his suit at 8:30. He said, "It's Shabbat today." It turned out it wasn't. It was Thursday or Friday, but he woke up in the morning. He thought it was Shabbat. He made a mistake.
Was he having other problems?
Yeah. Do you make
Yeah, he made a mistake. So
You could
it can
fly
happen.
internationally and come across the
Yeah.
date line and have
It could also
totally confused as
it could
to what
also
day
it could also just happen that you wake up in the morning and you forget what day it is. It happens. All right. So, but anyway, so so whatever the case may be, in that case, chayav al kol Shabbat v'Shabbat. So what is the mistake there? You're chayav for the Shabbat. So let's say you didn't know it was Shabbat. The entire day you did 100 melachot. So we don't say the person has to bring 100 korbanot. We say he made one mistake. He didn't know it was Shabbat. If you didn't know what Shabbat is, so all of your mistakes on all of the Shabbatot are really one mistake. You didn't know what Shabbat is. If you know what Shabbat is, but you didn't know today was Shabbat, so even if that happened multiple times, each Shabbat is just one mistake, that you didn't know it was Shabbat on that particular Shabbat. And whatever flowed from that is just a detail. Okay, now we say, Hayodea Shehu Shabbat. You woke up in the morning and you know it's Shabbat. Ve'asa melachot harbe b'Shabbatot harbe. And you did many melachot on many Shabbatot. Meaning to say, it's just using that phrase again. What it means is, you knew it was Shabbat, but you did many melachot because you didn't know those melachot were prohibited. Let's say, for instance, you didn't know that you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. Or whatever. So the person cooked on many Shabbatot. He knew it was Shabbat. He just didn't know cooking was prohibited. And he ended up violating the malacha of cooking. So what was his mistake? His mistake was, he didn't know about cooking. So let's say he didn't know about cooking and he also didn't know that you can't grind flour on Shabbat. So he ground flour and he also cooked. So he knew it was Shabbat. So not knowing about grinding is one mistake. Not knowing about cooking is another mistake. Let's say he also didn't know that you can't carry objects outside. He carried an object outside. So now that's 3 different mistakes. Because he knows it's Shabbat. But each area of halakha that he's unaware of is a separate error. Okay, so that's why for each melacha, even if he did it 10 times, it's still only one melacha. So he did, let's say he cooked on that Shabbat 10 times. Because he said, but was one mistake, he didn't know. He ground 10 times, he carried 10 times. But it was all one, each one was one mistake. He really made 3 mistakes. He didn't know that these 3 things were prohibited on Shabbat.
So the mistake is not that he is deficient in understanding what Shabbat's all about.
He knows there's Shabbat, he just didn't know this law. He didn't know the law.
That he is responsible for each particular
law that he didn't know. Right.
That's why this has implication in tochacha, where if somebody doesn't know, you have to really be careful in knowing whether if you tell them,
it's going to cause more problems.
Whether you're going to do them a disfavor,
could be.
then.
Right. So in that case, v'chayav al kol av melacha u'melacha. So in that case, what is he chayav for? Each melacha that he didn't know is one liability.
But this last person probably wants to know what the correct thing is.
This person is just ignorance, right? We're not talking about a person.
If you know, if you're a good idea that you're going to tell him and he's not going to care. Like somebody,
but that's b'mezid already. That's b'mezid already. It's a different category. Yeah. So here we're talking about fishogeg. We're talking about somebody who knows about Shabbat and they want to keep Shabbat. But like I knew somebody who didn't know that you can't use a microwave on Shabbat. He said it's not cooking. I'm just using a microwave.
Right.
So they were Baal Tshuva. Baal Tshuva. They didn't know. They didn't know. So that's an example. They didn't know. So
that one that she gave me a sandwich, kosher sandwich, Hebrew national.
Right.
I thought it's not kosher.
Right. They don't know.
You don't see the advertiser. We answer.
So higher there. Yeah. So if a person does many melachot that are the same type of melacha, which means to say it's a tolada. There are avot and toladot, we know. So we're gonna learn more about this later. So I don't want to go too much into the detail, but there are the general melachot, the father melachot, they're called avot, and the toladot, the derivative melachot. So principal melachot, if you do a principal melacha together with its tolada, together with a derivative melacha. For example, if you were to cook as well as heat up metal till it's very hot, both of these are toladot of cooking. I'm sorry, one is the av of cooking and the other one is the tolada, a derivative of the melacha. So anytime you do an av and a tolada, you're only culpable for the Av, only for the primary Melacha, because the other one is derivative. So the point is, we reduce it to its common denominator. We look for what was the error. If the error was you didn't know what Shabbat was, that's one error. If the error is you didn't know that it was Shabbat, but you did that many times, so each time you didn't know it was Shabbat, that's a separate error. If you didn't know a certain Melacha was prohibited, that's one error. If you didn't know 10 Melachot out of the 39 and you did all of them, even if you did them multiple times, it's only 10 errors still. Just multiplied, it manifested itself many times, but it was 10 errors because you didn't know these 10 things. Okay, now we get to the Gemara. The Gemara says, "My ta'ama tana kilal gadol." Why do you call this kilal gadol? Why is this a big rule? Why is it a big principle, a great principle? Kilal gadol. Maybe you're going to tell me the reason is because later on it's going to say another general principle later in this parak. It's going to tell us another general rule, which is a rule regarding hotza'ah, regarding carrying and the minimum amount of substance one carries to be liable for carrying. So since it's going to use the term kilal again, so it says kilal gadol to differentiate that this is a major principle. But if that's true, v'gabei shvi'it nami. And also we could say by shvi'it, in Masekhet Shabbat there's also a kilal gadol. Masekhet Shabbat talks about shemitah. Okay? It also says kilal gadol there, so you might say the same thing. Mishum dekaba'el mitnei od kilal acher. Tanei kilal gadol. So that's why it has Tana kilal gadol. That's why it teaches kilal gadol. In other words, maybe the rule is that anytime there's a principle and then another principle, so we say kilal gadol because there's a more inclusive principle and then a more specific principle. So we have a more inclusive principle here in kilal gadol. It's a more general principle, and then there's going to be a more specific one later. Similarly, in Masekhet Shabbat, there's kilal gadol, a general principle, and then a more specific one later, and that's why they do it. But why in Masekhet Maaser, which is another Masechet in Seder Zeraim, why there does it say only kilal? It doesn't say kilal gadol. It should say kilal gadol there too, because there are two kilalim there also, two general principles, one broader and one more specific. So why is not the same principle applied and we say kilal gadol the first time? So Amar Rabbi Yosef bar Ravin says, Shabbat u'shvi'it de'itbehu avot v'toladot tana gadol. Ma'aser de'ledba avot v'toladot lo tana kilal gadol. The answer is that Shabbat and Shvi'it have something in common. There are avot and toladot. There are primary labors and derivative labors. On Shabbat we know there's a whole complex array of labors. In Shemitah there are just 4 primary labors, which are sowing, reaping, pruning, and harvesting and removing the fruits. Okay, the grapes or whatever. Bitzira. Okay, so these 4 primary labors are the only ones that are called avot, and everything else is a toladah. So you have a concept of avot v'toladot. You have a very intricate structure to the halacha. So maybe that's why we have klal gadol when we speak about the macro level. So we use the term klal gadol because we're speaking macro, and we speak about details. Maybe that's why we're speaking about smaller klalim. But in maaser, where you don't have such a large structure of avot and toladot. Okay, you don't have such a large structure, so therefore you don't distinguish between klal gadol and a regular klal, a big principle and a regular principle. So the Gemara says that might work. That might work to differentiate why we have klal gadol only by Shabbat and Shemitah. However, ule bar kapara. But what about bar kapara? Ditanei klal gadol b'maaser. Because according to bar kapara, in his version of the Tosefta, it says klal gadol even by maaser. But you just told me that it shouldn't be by maaser. Because it does my avot or my toladot ika. There's no avot and toladot, and you just told me that the reason for saying klal gadol is when you have avot and toladot. So what's the answer? Ela lav ta'ama gadol onsho shel Shabbat yoter mishel Shvi'it. What's the reason? Because there's a hierarchy here. There's Shabbat, Shvi'it, and then there's Maaser, and they're in order of severity. How so? Because Gadol Onisho Shel Shabbat Yoter Mishal Shvi'it, because Shabbat is greater than Shemitah. Ilu Shabbat Ita ben betelush ben b'mechubar, v'ilu Shvi'it betelush leita b'mechubar Ita. That when it comes to Shabbat, halachot of Shabbat apply to things that are attached to the ground and are detached. Some halachot apply to things that are attached to the ground, such as harvesting. You're not allowed to do. digging in the ground, obviously you're not allowed to do. But it also applies to things that are detached from the ground. You can't cook, you can't knead, you can't grind, even if it's detached from the ground. Whereas Shemitah, the laws of, once Shemitah starts, the halachot of Shemitah only apply to things that are attached to the ground. Whatever you already harvested before Shemitah doesn't come under the rubric of Shemitah. It's saved from last year. However, v'gadol onesha shel Shvi'it is even more significant. Yoter min ha'ma'aser, it's greater than ma'aser dilu. Shvi'it ita ben b'machal adam ben b'machal behema. Because Shemitah applies both to things that are harvested for the sake of human consumption and for things that are harvested for the sake of animal consumption. You can't harvest anything in a commercial manner. Vilu ma'aser, but ma'aser b'machal adam ita b'machal behema leta. When it comes to ma'aser, the halacha only applies to food that's for human consumption, not to food that's for animal consumption. So this is a third level.
Yeah, but Shvit is allowed about Talush. You have to make it hefker.
That's all, but that's only something that grew during Shemitah.
Yes.
So it had to be attached to the ground in the beginning of Shemitah. It was attached to the ground. That's what it means. When Shemitah started, it was attached to the ground. Even if you detach it on Shemitah, now it can become prohibited. Right, you can have biur, right. That's a separate issue. But if it wasn't attached, if you detached it before Shemitah started, so then you're definitely okay. Whereas Shabbat, even if you detach things before Shabbat, there's still halachot that apply to that. So now we say, but ma'aser. So that's why the Chachamim, everyone else says that only Shabbat and Shemitah are called Klal Gadol because they have a superiority over Maaser. But Bar Kapara comes along, Bar Kapara Tatani Klal Gadol Maaser, Gadol Onsho Shel Maaser, Yoter Mishel Pe'ah. Maaser, he says that it's all relative. Maaser also has a stringency over Pe'ah. Pe'ah is leaving the corner of your field. When you harvest, you have to leave a corner of the field. How so? Because the ilu ma'aser ita betena v'yarak, because when it comes to ma'aser, when it comes to separating the tithe from your produce, so there it applies even to figs and it applies even to vegetables. Whereas v'ilu pe'ah ita betena v'yarak, but it doesn't apply when it comes to pe'ah, when it comes to leaving the corner of your field. It doesn't apply to figs and it doesn't apply to vegetables. Ditnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, klal amru b'pe'ah, because we said a general principle regarding pe'ah, kol shu ochel v'nishmar v'gidilo min haaretz ulukitato ki'achat u'machniso l'kiyum chayav b'pe'ah. What are the 5 things that a substance that a crop has to have? The 5 criteria to make it required, to make it obligated in pe'ah. The first is it has to be edible, it has to be ochel. It has to be nishmar, it has to be something that is protected, that you protect in order to grow it, not something that randomly grew in your field. V'gidulo min haaretz, okay? And it has to be something which is gidulo min haaretz, that is that grows from the ground. Ulkitato ki'achat. It has to be something that's harvested at the same time. In other words, you harvest it at once, which makes sense because if you're going to leave the corner of your field, you leave the corner of your field when you're harvesting. So it has to be something that's harvested all at once. And it has to be something that you bring into the house and it stays for a long time. Only then is it chayav b'pe'ah. Only then is it obligated in pe'ah. So what are the examples here? Ochel means, what does it mean? It has to be a food that it can't be the plants that were grown only for making dye. There were certain types of plants that they would grow for making dye. So that's not the kind of plants that would be subject to pe'ah v'nishmar, and it has to be something which is being guarded lima'utei hefker, which means if you come across a field that grew its hefker, it didn't belong to anybody, so it wasn't guarded, it wasn't protected for anybody's use, you don't have to leave a corner of that field. V'gidulo min haaretz, and it grew from the ground lima'utei kapein upitriot, that's to exclude truffles and mushrooms, that even though they look like they're growing on the ground, really they're not growing on, they're on the ground, but they're not growing from the ground. So they're not subject, even if you had a whole field of mushrooms, they're not chayav b'pe'ah, ulukitato ki'achat. It has to be something which is harvested in one fell swoop. That's to exclude figs. Figs ripen throughout the course of the season. They don't. Yeah, sure.
What is the clarification that they're seeking with the word major?
They're trying to figure out why they use the word gadol in reference to these mitzvot. Gadol in what sense?
In what sense?
In what sense is it gadol? So Shabbat is gadol because it's greater than Shemitah. Shemitah is called gadol because it's greater than Maaser. Okay. And now Bar Kapara is saying, well, but we can also call Maaser gadol because it's greater than Pe'ah.
In other words, they're saying if you're saying major, it has to be
significant than something else.
Okay.
Right.
And that's this. Okay.
Yeah. So it's saying, so Pe'ah has too many rules, basically. So it's more limited in its scope. Okay, so therefore, machnitzo lekiyum lema'uteh yarak. So you have these last two things are where pe'ah and ma'aser differ from one another, because pe'ah has a rule that it has to be something that's machniso lekiyum. It has to be something that lasts a long time in the cupboard, that you can keep it at home. Whereas, and it also has to be something which is harvested all at once. And figs, they ripen throughout the season. So there's not like, okay, we're going to do the fig harvest now. You can harvest figs throughout. Whereas, ve'ilu gabe ma'aser tenan, klal amru b'ma'aser kol shu ochel v'nishmar v'gdilo min haaretz, chayav b'ma'aser. Ve'ilu lekitato ke'achat u'machniso lekiyum, lo tenan. So you only have 3 out of those 5 criteria when it comes to ma'aser. When it comes to pe'ah, you have these extra 2 criteria, that it has to be something that's harvested all at once, and it has to be something that lasts a long time. By ma'aser, you don't have those 2 rules. So by ma'aser, you have only the rule that it is that it's the 3 rules, that it has to grow from the ground, that it has to be protected, meaning that it wasn't hefker, it belonged to somebody who was guarding it, and that it's a food for human consumption. But you don't have the rule that it has to be something that lasts a long time. Therefore, vegetables are included in maaser. Vegetables that don't last a long time, like if you bring, let's say, for example, Rashi says turnips into the house, or you bring peppers into the house, or you bring cucumbers into the house. They don't last very long. Even with refrigeration, they don't last that long. You can't save them for that long. And there's no rule by ma'aser that it has to be something that's harvested all at once. So even figs are obligated in ma'aser. So ma'aser is of a grander scope than pe'ah, because pe'ah is more restrictive in the types of vegetables it's going to apply to and the types of fruits it's going to apply to. And that's why ma'aser, Bar Kapara says, can be called greater relative to pe'ah, because there are more things that are subject to ma'aser than pe'ah.
I would put ma'aser above shmita also, because there's a few of meat and b'dei shemayim for trumos, and trumos ma'aser. So I would put it next to Shabbat. That's it.
Right. Well.
Shabbat has skila, and this has meat
right.
and b'dei shemayim.
Right. Well, that's true. Right. It could be between Shabbat and Shvi'it. You mean?
Yeah.
It could be between Shabbat and Shmita. Right. From the perspective of the onesh, in theory, yeah, and from the perspective of onesh, you could argue that maaser would be even more serious than shmita, because shmita is just a lav that you get malkot, you get 39 lashes for doing it, whereas for truma, for not taking maaser for tevel, it's much more stringent, especially for the trumat maaser. You're right, but they're not looking at it from. You could see from here that they're not looking at it from onesh, because even when it compares Shabbat to Shmita, it doesn't say, well, this is skilan karet and Shmita is just malkot arba'im. It doesn't say that. It doesn't focus on that. It focuses on the applicability. So it's saying on Shabbat the applicability is to everything. On Shmita it's only to things that are attached to the ground. In Maaser, it's only to things, it's to more things than it is for Pe'ah. So it's looking at the range of applicability, because since we're talking about the greatness of the rule, right, a klal gadol, so we want to look at to what does this rule apply is what makes it so great. So Shabbat has the widest applicability of any of these rules, because it basically applies to everything. There's no substance you have that doesn't apply to. So that's a very interesting way of looking at it. So Rav Shmuel, but that's a very good point. So it brings out the point. So Rav Shmuel Damri Tarvayu. Now we get to the issue that you raised. So Rav and Shmuel said as follows: Matnitin batinok shenishba leben anochrim veger shenitgayer leben anochrim aval hikiru lebesof shachach hayav al kol Shabbat v'Shabbat. So the first version of Rav and Shmuel is a radical re-editing, basically revision of our Mishnah, because according to this version of Rav and Shmuel, which eventually is going to be amended, but working with it now, okay, what Rav and Shmuel are saying is our Mishnah is talking about a person who was a tinok shenishba, who grew up not with any concept of Shabbat, or a ger shenitgayer ben anochrim, a ger that became converted in a non-Jewish environment, and therefore grew up with no concept of Shabbat. And as Tosafot says here, the Bet Din didn't mention Shabbat to them when they converted. There's a whole literature based on this one-line Tosafot about what does this mean, about what a Bet Din has to inform a convert of for it to be a kosher conversion. Since you see here that there's such a case as a convert that doesn't even know what Shabbat is and it's still a valid conversion. So it's very interesting. So there's a whole discussion of this. But in any case, so Rav and Shmuel say that our Mishnah, the first case in our Mishnah that said you only have to bring one korban chatat, where it said that kol hashocheach ikar Shabbat, it doesn't really mean that the person knew about it and forgot. That case is a person who never knew about Shabbat. They grew up in a completely secular home. They had a Chanukah bush, and that was it. They never had any concept of Shabbat, and therefore, when they find out about Shabbat, they are only obligated in one korban. But a person who knew about Shabbat and forgot, that person is chayav al kol Shabbat v'Shabbat. Every Shabbat that he missed, since the time that he forgot about the concept of Shabbat, in other words, he was raised with Shabbat, and he just completely forgot about it, abandoned it, and forgot about it totally, that person...
Forgot the concept.
He forgot the concept of Shabbat.
The day today was Shabbat.
Right, he forgot the concept of Shabbat completely. That person, Rav and Shmuel are saying, would be obligated every Shabbat. For every Shabbat he misses. They're changing the Mishnah. They're changing the way we read the Mishnah.
Right, but in the second, but even in the second interpretation, when they say forget, is it like forget like dementia, or is it forget that it didn't?
It becomes a non-issue. It seems like it means it became a non-issue for them. They forgot it. It's hard to envision exactly what it means. How do you distinguish that from b'mezid, doing it on purpose? I mean, right. So it means like he assimilated. He assimilated, and he just forgot about it. He assimilated.
There's a difference between forgetting and not caring.
Right. So we're just saying it's a gradual assimilation. The person forgot about it.
Okay.
They just you ask the person, they might have grown up with Shabbat. They go, yeah, Shabbat, I remember. But if you reminded them, they might remember. But now they don't even think about it. They forgot. Yeah, many. So Rav and Shmuel are saying that's not the case. The only case of a person who brings only one korban is a person who never knew about Shabbat and they just discovered it. That person brings one korban, but somebody who knew about it and forgot, every Shabbat they forgot, is going to be liable. That's the way Rav and Shmuel are reading it now. We're going to see it's going to be amended, but that's what they're saying now. Okay? So that's what they say so far. Tanan hashochech ikar Shabbat, but what about the very first line of the Mishnah? It doesn't say he never knew about Shabbat. It says hashochech. He forgot. Lav miklav dahav amikara. Doesn't that mean that he knew originally and he forgot? You're saying it means somebody who never knew about Shabbat. But it says hashocheach. That means he forgot. That means he knew. So he says, lo, my kol hashocheach ikar Shabbat. Right? What does it mean that he forgot? Dahaita shachuach mimenu ikara shel Shabbat. It means that it was forgotten from him, meaning it was absent from his consciousness always. Okay? But we're still saying that if he knew it at any point in his life and he forgot Shabbat, he's going to be liable for every Shabbat. Okay? That's what they're saying so far. This is a provisional explanation. Okay. So what basically Rav and Shmuel are doing is pushing our Mishnah one level further. So now we're pushing back one level. So we're saying the first case that says you only have to bring one korban, that's where you never knew about Shabbat. The person who knew about Shabbat but forgot it completely, forgot the concept of Shabbat completely, that person is still going to be obligated for every single Shabbat. Not like we originally thought, that person's only making one mistake and therefore they're only going to be liable for one Shabbat. We're going to say since that person once knew, now they're obligated for every Shabbat. So now the Gemara says, but wait a second, but what about the case that said the person who knows about Shabbat but did many melachot and many Shabbatot because he forgot it was Shabbat. In other words, he knows the concept of Shabbat, but he forgot it was Saturday, he thought it was Sunday. So it says, Chayav kol Shabbat v'Shabbat, litni hikiru l'vasov shachach v'kol shekinha. According to you, that case is wrong. In other words, according to you, that the case of the person who knew about Shabbat and completely forgot about it is the same as what it says in our Mishnah, the person who knew it was Shabbat, who knew about Shabbat, but forgot what day it was.
Because on the interpretation that we just saw, it wouldn't be the same, because one is b'shogeg and one is b'mezid. Right? If you forgot because you didn't care, that's b'mezid. It's not b'shogeg. Right? In other words, you just don't care.
You assimilated. It could have been gradual. We don't have to say it's b'mezid.
The whole thing. But if you want to, observe Shabbat and you forgot about something, that's clearly b'shogeg.
Right.
So that's a major difference.
Well, what he said, but what the Gemara is saying is, according to Rav and Shmuel, we're pushing everything forward. So we're saying, okay, the person that we originally thought was only obligated for one korban, who was the person who forgot about Shabbat completely, the concept. Okay? So that person is really going to be obligated for every Shabbat that they miss, since he once knew about Shabbat.
Okay.
So now what about the case that we thought was the one that you're obligated for every Shabbat, which was the case where he knew about Shabbat, but he thought today was Sunday?
Where you forgot it was Shabbat, not just...
But you know the concept, you just forgot what day it was.
Okay.
That's where we thought you were obligated for each Shabbat as a unit. So why does it mention that in the Mishnah? You're saying that the case where you're obligated for each and every Shabbat is where you forgot that you knew the concept of Shabbat and forgot it. Okay? And that the only case where you're obligated in just one Korban is when you never knew the concept of Shabbat.
Right.
Okay? But when you knew it and then you forgot it, you're actually obligated for every Shabbat. So then why does our Mishnah say that the case where you're obligated for every Shabbat is where you know that there's Shabbat and you forgot what day it is? Tell me that when you forgot the concept of Shabbat, you're already obligated for every Shabbat. Certainly, when you knew the concept of Shabbat and forgot what day it is, you're going to be obligated for every Shabbat. It should be the same thing. So now the Gemara says, "Mai hayodea ikar Shabbat." Mi shehaya yodea ikara shel Shabbat ushchacha. Okay, so it says. So what does it mean? The person who knew ikar Shabbat. Okay, in other words, what does it mean? The person who knew that Shabbat existed and forgot what day it was. It means our case, the person who knew Shabbat and forgot the concept of Shabbat. Aval lo shechacha mai chayav al kol melacha umelacha. We're going to push it forward again and say that if you made a mistake and if you never knew of Shabbat, you're only obligated one korban. If you knew the concept of Shabbat and completely forgot it, you're obligated for each and every Shabbat you missed. And if you knew the concept of Shabbat and you remembered it, but you messed up and thought it was Sunday, chayav al kol melacha umelacha. We're going to hold you responsible for each and every melacha. Okay? So wait, the Gemara says, but there's a problem. Because the Mishnah says that if you knew it was Shabbat and you did many melachot, if you knew that it was Shabbat, you know what day it is today, and you do many melachot, you're obligated for every melacha. So according to you though, when are you obligated for every melacha? Even if you didn't know what day it is. In other words, if you knew the concept of Shabbat and you thought it was Sunday and did 10 melachot, you're telling me that you're obligated for every melacha. But our Mishnah says that when are you obligated for every melacha? When you know it's Shabbat, but you made a mistake about melachot. You're telling me even if you made a mistake and you thought it was Sunday and did many melachot, that you're obligated for each melacha. But that's not what it says in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that you have to know it's Shabbat and make a mistake about melachot. Not that you thought it was Sunday and did many melachot.
And you're not allowed to bump that up.
They can't. There's no further to go up, right? There's no further to bump it up. So rather we have to reject this interpretation of the Mishnah. Matnitin, we can't make 4 levels. In other words, the way that they're doing it now, they're making 4 levels. They're saying level 1 is you never knew about Shabbat. That's one korban. Level 2 is you knew about Shabbat at some point in your life. You've completely forgot it. That's you're obligated for every Shabbat. Level 3 is you know about the concept of Shabbat, but you thought it was Sunday, and you're going to be obligated for every melacha you do on that day that you thought was Sunday. Level 4 is that you know it's Shabbat. You know it's Shabbat, but you made a mistake and you didn't know certain things were prohibited on Shabbat. So what's the level 4? What are we going to do now? You're obligated for each and every melacha also. So it's level 3 and 4 are going to be the same.
Yeah.
Right? So So what are we going to do now? So rather, our Mishnah, everybody agrees, level 1 is where you once knew about the concept of Shabbat and you forgot it. And they agree with that as well. Okay, what they're saying is, what they meant was that a tinok shenishba is the same as a person who once knew and then forgot. This is what it meant to say. In other words, what they were saying was, you might think that the person who never knew about Shabbat and just discovered it wouldn't be liable for anything. What they're saying is that a person who once knew about Shabbat and completely forgot, and the person who was a tinok shenishba leben anochrim, the person who never knew about Shabbat, are the same. They're both obligated in one korban. So they never meant to make a 4th level. They weren't carving out a 4th level. They were just telling you that the first level includes not just tashocheach, not just the person who forgot, but also the person who never knew. That was what they were trying to say.
Justify that.
Well, we're going to say it's a whole discussion. Now, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish say, Damrei Tarvayu, Davka Shehikir Ulu V'Sof Shachach. It's only if they knew about it and forgot. Aval Tinok Shenishba ben Anochrim, Ve'ger Shenitgayer ben Anochrim, Patur. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish say, no. If you never knew, it's not called shogeg. You didn't know. You have to have known and forgotten.
Even in the deeper sense, you know, because your soul stood at the Mount Sinai.
They don't invoke that though. They don't invoke a metaphysical reason.
Okay.
We'll see how they get to it. But the point is that what they're saying is unawareness of, this is the machloket. What do we do with the tinok shenishba? So, Meitive, there is the following objection. This is an objection to Rabbi Yochanan because it supports Rav and Shmuel. Kalal Gadol Amru b'Shabbat. They said a great principle about Shabbat. This is from the Tosefta. Kol hashokech ikar Shabbat v'asa melachot harbei b'Shabbatot harbei eno chayav ela achat. A person who forgot the concept of Shabbat. This is the first case in our Mishnah, and he did many melachot and many Shabbatot because he forgot the concept of Shabbat altogether. So he only brings one korban for the one mistake. Ketzad. What's the case? Tinok shenishba leben anochrim. A child who grew up among non-Jews. Ve'ger shenitger ben anochrim. Or a ger who became a convert among nochrim. V'asa melachot harbei b'Shabbatot harbei. Eno chayav ela chatat achat. Such a person is only obligated for one chatat. Now, why does this sort of make sense? It sort of makes sense because, just intuitively, because it's very, very hard to imagine the case of the person who completely forgets the concept of Shabbat who actually knew about it.
Right.
It's easier to imagine a person who just never knew about it.
Right.
Okay? Ve'chayav ala dam achat ve'ala chaylev achat ve'ala avodah zara achat. And similarly, this person who grew up in a Christian, one of these kids who was, taken by a Christian family and he was worshiping Jesus his whole life, okay? And he was eating, right? All these people who are, right? So eating chaylev, eating everything. So for everything that he did, one chatat, because he didn't know. It was one thing. He just didn't know about this one thing. He didn't know about chaylev. If I had known, Hashem told me not to eat chaylev, I wouldn't have eaten it. I didn't know. So each mistake he made, one chatat, because he never knew. Munbaz Poter, who has my favorite name in all of Shas. Munbaz is just a cool name.
Munbaz?
Yeah, Munbaz is a cool name. Munbaz says, no, he's exempt. And he doesn't appear very often in the Shas, very few times. He was a Tana. He said he exempts. He says, no, a tinok shenishba leben anochrim, a ger shenitgayer leben anochrim, the person who never knew, who grew up with no Judaism, or converted with no Judaism, and again,
it was not even one chat.
And again, this is even more controversial because it's implying that a person could convert without even knowing about avodah zarah, which is really very, very unusual. So the person who grows up without knowing about this, Munbaz says he never knew about it; he's exempt. But the Tanna Kama says one chatat for each violation.
So we're having problem conversions even then.
Yeah. Munbaz dan lifnei Rabbi Akiva, and this was the conversation between Munbaz and Rabbi Akiva. Ho'ilu mezid karoi choteh v'shogeg karoi choteh. A person who does something on purpose is called a choteh, a sinner. And somebody who does something by accident is called a sinner. Mam mezid shaita lo yediah, af shogeg shaita lo yediah. Just like the mezid, the person who does something on purpose, to be called a sinner, a choteh, someone who makes an error, you have to know something.
Right.
You have to have a framework. So he says the mezid has a framework that he's rebelling against. The shogeg should also have a framework that he's making a mistake in. This person doesn't have a framework. It makes sense. Yeah. It makes sense. Amar Rabbi Akiva says, Hareni mosif al dvarecha. I'm going to do what we call reductio ad absurdum. Okay, what we would call in logical terms. I'm going to show you that you're wrong by taking it to a logical absurdity. I'm going to take your reasoning to absurdity. You want to compare mezid and shogeg, huh? You want to compare on purpose and by accident. Okay, just like the mezid knows what he's doing at the time he's doing it. So, af shogeg shaita lo yediah b'shat ma'aseh. So too, the shogeg has to know what he's doing at the time he's doing it. So you just erase the concept of shogeg. You just erase the concept of shogeg. In other words, he's saying you're making an equation because Munbaz is saying that even shogeg is a level. Because shogeg means you knew something and you made a mistake. Right? And you forgot. So Rabbi Akiva, and how do I know that? Because a mezid has a framework that he rebels against and a shogeg makes a mistake, right? They're similar.
But he's not calling it shogeg. He doesn't know anything
He's
about
saying
it.
that's what Munbaz. But that's what Munbaz is saying. That Munbaz's point is that this. How can you call him a shogeg? From what? So. But Rabbi Akiva is saying, but you're making an equation between. How are you getting the idea that a shogeg has to know something from the mezid? Because they're both called chotim. They're both called sinners. So, but if that's the case, let's take it further. Let's say, just like you want to make an equation between mezid and shogeg, between on purpose and by accident? Okay, just like the on purpose knows when he's doing it, he knows what he's doing. The shogeg also knows what he's doing when he's doing it. So according to you, every shogeg has to be a mezid to qualify.
That doesn't make sense.
No, that doesn't follow.
Why not?
Because by definition, forgetting is not in consciousness.
But he's saying, how far do you take because Rabbi Akiva is saying,
But then you can't use
because Rabbi
forgetting.
Akiva will say like this, he'll say, you know what? What is the definition of shogeg? Unaware. Okay? The Tinok Shenishba is unaware.
Yeah.
He didn't forget, he's unaware. In other words, an unaware violation. You drive through a red light, you say, I was unaware, the cop says, I don't care. Okay? In other words, unaware. So that's the machloket here. Munbaz is trying to say that what does shogeg mean? Shogeg means you knew when you made a mistake and you forgot. Forgetfulness. Okay? Lack of vigilance, we could call it. It's a lack of vigilance.
No,
okay?
but it's not a lack of
forgot,
vigilance.
because you lost it.
And it's different than the red light.
you forgot.
Because the red light, you wouldn't be on the road if you didn't know about the red light.
Well, some people seem to... What?
The Tinok never had it.
Right, but that's what I'm trying to say.
You talk about forgetting.
Exactly, though. But that's what I'm saying. In other words, so let's start over. Yeah. So that's the whole argument here. In other words, Munbaz and Rabbi Akiva are having a fundamental argument about what is bishogeg. You could put it in these terms. Munbaz is saying, what does bishogeg mean? It means a person who forgot. Okay, which we could say is a type of lack of vigilance, meaning they neglected it, they forgot it. Okay, they fell out of awareness of it.
Yeah, but
wait, let me finish. But what is Rabbi Akiva saying? What is bishogeg? Unawareness. I don't care if it's unawareness because you knew before and you forgot. I don't care if it's unawareness because you simply are unaware, because you never knew. In other words, Rabbi Akiva is saying, and once you try to elevate the level of bishogeg to the level of the mezid, where does it stop?
Then it's a different thing. Because you
Akiva
Right, but Rabbi Akiva is not buying that. In other words, Rabbi Akiva is saying you have two categories.
Yeah.
You've got aware and unaware.
Yeah.
Okay? So you want to say that mezid is the same as shogeg, then you're saying you have to be aware.
Yeah.
So then you're just saying that they're the same.
Right.
Munbaz is saying, no. There's a difference, okay? So that's the machloket, okay? So now what does Munbaz say? But it's very interesting machloket. I find this parak fascinating.
I'm with Munbaz.
I find this whole parak fascinating. It's a fascinating discussion. So what does he say? So he says to him, okay, so Amar Lo said back to him, Hen, v'kol sheken shosafta. He said, thank you very much, you're right.
Who said
What?
Munbaz
says, you're right.
Don't argue about it.
Okay? Don't argue about it. But no, he's not retracting. He's saying, I'll take that too. You're right, you do have to have a certain level of awareness even when you violate. Even when you violate, you have to have awareness.
Right.
Okay, and we're going to see what this means later. So Amar Lo, he said to him, Lidvarecha en zakor shogeg el mezid. How do you differentiate between shogeg and mezid? In other words, that's the whole problem between Rabbi Akiva and Munbaz. This discussion is going to be elaborated upon later. Okay? They're going to come back to it. Right now, they're just bringing it up because it's the end of the Tosefta. They're going to come back and explain what exactly Munbaz's reason is and what exactly Rabbi Akiva's reason is tomorrow. But just to get to the point here, Katani Mihav, the main point that we brought this up was because what does the Tosefta use as its example of somebody who forgot Ikar Shabbat, which is our case in the Mishnah? What's the example that they bring? It is that Ketzad Tinok Shenishba. In other words, the Tosefta makes an equation between somebody who forgot the whole concept of Shabbat and somebody who never knew it, which is exactly what Rav and Shmuel said, but that's against what Rabbi Yochanan said, because Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were saying that no, if somebody never knew, they're completely exempt. So Bishlam al Rabbi Shmuel Nicha, that's okay according to Rabbi Shmuel, el Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Kashya. The problem is, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, it's a difficulty because they said that no, a Tinok Shenishba is nothing. He's not going to anything. So they said, Amrei Lach, they're going to say to you, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, they're going to say, Lo, mi ika munbaz de patar, anandam rinan ke munbaz. Isn't there munbaz who says that a Tinok Shenishba is exempt? We hold like him. And he would read our Mishnah. How is Munbaz going to read this Mishnah? Why doesn't he argue in the Mishnah? He's a Tana. Why not? Because he reads the Mishnah, Kol ha-shocheach hikar Shabbat, literally. Somebody who knew about Shabbat and forgot it. So we're reading it like Munbaz read it. You see, there's a precedent for reading that. Meaning that somebody who never knew it isn't included at all. They don't even come into the category of shogeg at all. And tomorrow we're going to continue with explaining what is Munbaz's reasoning, where does he draw the line between shogeg and mezid, and what is the machloket between him and Rabbi Akiva.
I think that